Good evening. It's wonderful to be able to welcome you all. And I can't really see. But anyway, my name is Andrea Capovilla, and I'm the director of one of the centers which make up the Institute for Languages, Cultures and Societies, namely the Ingeborg Bachmann Center for Austrian Literature. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Till Greite. Till has become a valued colleague here, off and on, over the past few years. He was a fellow at our Exile Center, working on the papers of Michael Hamburger, which are held at the British Library, and now continues his work as part of a bigger postdoc project as a Sylvia Nash Fellow, part of his project, his work he's doing here. He also spoke at last May's conference on Ingeborg Bachmann. Recently, Till has edited the Berlin novel Das Glück der Andernachs, 1947, written by the Berlin-born and later exiled novelist Wilhelm Speyer, who was a close friend and collaborator of Walter Benjamin and Franz Hessel. That is forthcoming this year in October, I believe.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. Tiny bit of housekeeping, the usual. You're most welcome to ask questions after the talk. As the lecture is being recorded, you implicitly consent to be recorded as well when you speak, or alternatively, you can enter the conversation by typing in the chat box. And I will hand over to Till without any further ado, so we do have time afterwards. Till will present his forthcoming book in May this year, Die Leere Zentrale, Berlin, ein Bild aus dem deutschen Nachkrieg, eine literaturgeschichtliche Begehung. Till, over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. And thank you for your kind introduction. And also thank you, of course, to Jane Lewin for actually organizing this talk today. And I also have to thank the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies at the SAS for having me here in London again for the second time. And now as a Sylvia Nash research fellow, and of course for their support of my current research project entitled The Legacy of Exile on Michael Hamburger. But however, today I would like to take the opportunity, as Andrea said, to talk about a different topic. I will now present some results of my doctoral research, which I finished at the Humboldt University, Berlin in 22. Hang on, and I hope you can see the presentation now, yeah? Okay.
We can see.
Perfect. Okay, my presentation today, which concerns my forthcoming book, Die Leere Zentrale, Berlin, ein Bild aus dem deutschen Nachkrieg, falls into three parts. In the first, I sketch out the methodological and historiographical issues that orient my work. The second section will then zoom in more closely on a handful of pivotal examples in the hope of providing you with a firm sense of the material at issue. And in the final step of my presentation, I will discuss some of the concrete locations in Berlin that are thematized by the writers I study. It is no coincidence that the activity of walking and the issue of the image are both invoked in the title of my book on Berlin's literary topography. The premise of this connection is that the on-site inspection of the terrain entails its disclosure as a human space, that is, phenomenologically speaking, a space experienced by embodied beings. In my case, this approach implies both the close examination of the mostly vacant urban space and of literary historical field. Space appears in the course of my work as a field of reflections, what I call Berlin's empty center in the post-war era. It is, I believe, a rather under-researched topic, and the goal of my book is to draw out the principal features of this uncharted territory. In devising my study, I was guided by a remark by the poet Paul Celan, which underscored for me the poetological implications of my project. In an ironic reference to the German philological branch of topos research, Celan once said, "Literature is certainly about topos, Forschung, but im Hinblick auf das noch zu Erforschende, with respect to that which has still to be researched. This was an eye-opening claim and served as an ongoing reminder that literary research must commit itself to underexplored fields. So what I want to say is that the empty center has surely something in common with classical topoi of literary scholarship, like the locus suspectus, the uncanny place, or the locus terribilis, the place of disaster, and even the post-catastrophic idyllic place. However, my basic assumption is that Berlin's empty center touches all these topoi, but is not identical to any of them and inhabits an interstitial space among them, yet undetermined topos. My work offers a reading of some of the best-known Berlin literature between 1930 to the 1970s, with a decided emphasis on the post-war period. For that reason, I deal with the epochal rift of Nazi tyranny that bisects this historical field. My work does, of course, not attempt to bridge this disastrous rupture with all its effects on the post-war world, but rather to traverse it in new ways on the basis of archival research in Germany and abroad, revealing overlooked connections in literary history. In executing this project, I was confronted with the problem of how to rethink the notorious zero point in German history after Nazism. My answer to this question was to replace the common historiographical zero hour, Stunde Null, with a topographical metaphor that enabled me to reflect the major turn post-1945. It offers a reorientation by thinking time and space. Early on in the conception of my project, the image of the empty center helped me to arrive at the core of my investigation. I was guided by the hermeneutic premise that every understanding has to question the unsaid of an author, of a work of art, or of a particular period. The unspeakable itself, after expulsion, terror, war, and collapse, was both concretely and at the same time allegorically concentrated in Berlin's inner tabula rasa. The pictorial discovery of an empty urban heart evoked, moreover, the aesthetic problem of German literary expression after 1945. This is why I speak in my book of Berlin's post-war topography as a piece of the most real ground that German literature could find on its own territory after the war. Berlin was, at the same time, real and unreal, a place that, haunted by the painful legacy of recent history, assumed an uncanny aspect. To draw on a term introduced by the cultural historian Wolfgang Koeppen, who inspired my work, Berlin's cold crater features the side of an eerie, real surrealism. The empty center represented an unofficial commons, a hidden lucus communis of German-speaking post-war literature. Its literary commentators arrived from the West and the East, as well as from several places of exile. Berlin's empty center was sought out as a focal point for personal and historical experiences of all kind. In this respect, the topos was regarded as a land of a special kind, an enclave-like place that the exiled Berlin-born poet and critic Michael Hamburger aptly described as a third land, precariously positioned between the Cold War blocks. Thus, it cites the empty field around Potsdamer Platz, the old power center around Wilhelmstraße, the quiet district of Tiergarten, sponsored a literary dialogue on the city's history, an imaginary one, which the authors themselves were not fully aware of having. An example for such a place of encounter, what I call the delta of the empty centers, or the inner delta, is the once impressive Anhalter Bahnhof, which in the days of Walter Benjamin served as a nodal point connecting Berlin to Western Europe, but subsequently became a place of expulsion and deportation. After 1945, as an extraterritorial station in the isolated space of West Berlin, it became the epitome of what Benjamin designated a dialectical image of petrified unrest. In the burned-out hall of the Anhalter train station, the novelist Wolfgang Koeppen wrote during a post-war visit to the city, "The grass grows and children make noise." Consequently, only a special type of witness found access to this unusual locus. In my study, I looked for authors whom Hamburger, in his critical study after the Second Flood, called bearers of witness, those who shared the painful experience of Berlin's catastrophe. One of my essential tasks in researching for this book was to look for literary testimonies from the generation that survived National Socialism, which could speak for historical continuities and ruptures. I tried to find testimonials to get a picture of the brutal shift that transformed a flourishing city into a cold crater. My search set fresh light on a generation that in art history is referred to as a lost generation, but which has received less attention in literary scholarship. I adopted the term for the generation born around 1900 that includes both those in exile and those of an inner immigration who remained in Germany during the Nazi period. This generation in particular gained a stereoscopic perspective on Berlin, juxtaposing the ruins of the war with reminiscences from years beforehand, and thereby rendering the old inner city, to borrow an expression of Andrew Webber's, a field of memories. The notion of the stereoscopic view is taken from Benjamin. He referred once to the flaneur as a kind of local historian shaped by intimate knowledge of the city's past and present. And exactly this virtue returned with some of the most prominent post-war flaneurs like Wolfgang Koeppen, Günther Anders, and Martin Kessel, as well as female writers like Gabriele Tergit and Marie-Louise Kaschnitz. These men and women shared a particular viewpoint, creating doubly exposed images of the ruined cityscape. Precisely this group of writers obsessively circling around Berlin's empty center considered this black hole as their key metaphor for experiences they had to confront. Their testimonies include traumatic suffering. I would like to emphasize an insight here by the Hungarian psychoanalyst Sándor Ferenczi, who remarked that in cases of trauma, there is no direct way of communicating painful experiences. Doing so demands forms of metaphorization, which lend indirect voice to the unsaid. I believe that it is for this reason that I discovered a proliferation of small, dense forms, and notably literary fragments, among those authors. The small pieces, including poems, aphorisms, letters, journal entries, and still more, added something to the jigsaw picture of an empty center in post-war Berlin literature. To these untimely flaneurs, the heart of the city resembled a horrifyingly hollow shell. That is why my study employs another metaphor to describe it, the psychoanalytic concept of the crypt. This concept evokes the phenomenon of a cavernous space with psychic connotations. The expression intends to make visible unsettled yet persistent issues in the aftermath of catastrophe. The concept is taken from the Hungarian-French psychoanalyst couple Nicholas Abraham and Maria Tarak. They argue that every trauma produces a secret crypt that entombs an unspeakable pain or grief. Crypt, therefore, describes a walled-up and preserved shock that can have a long-term effect even on a transgenerational scale. I argue that we can identify these dynamics at work in Berlin's empty center too. Taking the concept of crypt seriously, furthermore, allows us to recognize that the empty center of Berlin was a metaphor for collective memory, or rather a lack of memory in the post-war era. This idea has similarities, of course, to phenomena that scholars like Andreas Huyssen described as the city's symptomatic voids and vacant spaces. However, in my work, I refer to a slightly different interpretation advanced by the French essayist and filmmaker Claude Lanzmann, who used the expression of a trou de mémoire for Berlin, a memory gap, and a hole as a place for commemoration. And indeed, at the center of Berlin, post-1945, appeared to survivors from the pre-war period turned upside down, as the philosopher in exile Günther Anders observed. He coined the motive of a Stadtumstülpung, a turning inside out of the city as center became periphery and vice versa. The heart of the city, Anders claimed, was a peculiar Zeitgegend, a time area, as he perceived it on his return to Europe. So the center was not simply reduced to ruin, but rather to a non-place of profound and uncanny silence. Berlin emerges here as topographical metaphor for a number of problems spanning from historiographical to aesthetical and ethical issues. My book consists of 16 interlocking chapters with an opening and fade out, with discussions of Oskar Larke and Michael Hamburger, respectively. The first part explores the topography of the ruined German capital by using the stereoscopic point of view. I juxtapose authors of an inner emigration with those who fled Nazi Germany due to their Jewish background. This part circles around the challenges of poetically mapping and lending literary representation to a place. My approach here was, as I mentioned, inspired by Celan. I also devote attention to less-known writers, including the Berlin-based Martin Kessel, occasional visitors like Kaschnitz, and immigrants like Anders, writers who were among the first to traverse the devastated area. They noticed a series of new phenomena, including an uncanny silence, as Kessel. They also discovered the aforementioned inversion of center and periphery, as for instance Anders, and as well as overlooked aftermath effects, the shockwaves of a delayed awareness in Berlin, as especially Kaschnitz. They thus linked the perception of haunting after images with the survivor's problem of conscience. The novelist and essayist Wolfgang Koeppen in particular served as key witness to the catastrophe of the city, as reflected in his unfinished Brandenburg project, which sought to paint a portrait of Berlin extending from the 1930s through the post-war years. Revealingly, the project remained fragmentary. In Koeppen's writing, the Romanisches Café, as the former genius loci of Weimar Berlin, emerged as a focal point, a memory site of vanished Berlin, a phantom of his search. The sealed space around Gedächtniskirche, the Memorial Church, and Hitler's bunker tomb near Tiergarten, nowadays just across the street from the Holocaust Memorial, became symbols of a general encapsulation in these years and exhibited the presence of the uncanny in Germany's post-war culture. The third and fourth parts of my book are dedicated to authors on both sides of the subsequently divided city, highlighting a continuity of emigration and inner immigration. In West Berlin, this walled-in island, I focus on cases of remigration, like the Polish Witold Gombrowicz, who returned from Argentina in exile to Europe via a Ford Foundation-sponsored Berlin program. He offered the unusual view of an old European flaneur capable of revealing the dubious atmosphere the city's repressed past. For East Berlin, I focus on poets of another inner immigration, like Peter Huchel, editor of the journal Sinn und Form, and the poet Johannes Bobrowski, both later dissidents and marginalized figures who opposed the dogma of socialist realism. They accomplished this by writing between the lines, a well-known Berlin strategy, a verdecktes Schreiben, in order to evade censorship in the eastern half of the city. This tradition can be traced back to figures like Oskar Loerke, who belonged to the first inner immigration during the Third Reich. The final chapter of my study is dedicated to an author whose Berlin writings brilliantly captures the complexity of the city as an allegorical site, as a place of traumatic re-encounters. The author at issue is the exiled Michael Hamburger, who was expelled from Germany in 1933 due to his Jewish heritage. With his eyes of the emigre, we see how the city confronted survivors of the Nazi catastrophes, of the Shoah in particular, with their own intermittent memoir, to use his expression. He knew the eloquent silence of authors of the so-called lost generation through his work as a translator, in addition to personal encounters and friendships. Perhaps more than anyone else, Hamburger circled around the silence in Berlin. As a post-war flaneur, he tried to get to the core of his experience as a displaced poet. A piece of truth about this time, its traumata, losses, and challenges could be found nowhere else than in the oppressive stillness of Berlin's empty center. So with this horizon of historiographical and literary issues now in view, I'd like to take a closer look at some comments on the post-war phenomenon called empty center. Within my body of text, I first stumbled across the image in a statement by the poet Gottfried Benn, in which he juxtaposes pre- and post-war Berlin. In a late television interview for West Berlin's Sender Freies Berlin, the author, working on the city's myth, described pre-war Berlin. He designated it a former Zentrale, or center of intellectual Europe, a once corrupt but fascinating town. Ben was not alone in using this metaphor of a center of intellectual force, as the example of Oskar Loerke shows, to designate the vanished Weimar Berlin. However, Ben survived and commented on its post-war transformation. According to him, the former intellectual hothouse had become a Pompeii in the jungle, a trauma-scape, as the expelled Gabriele Tergit similarly remarked upon her return from British exile. The inner city had become an empty center with wastelands and barbed wire. They noted a city in decline. In contrast to its heyday, the Weimar period of talents and cultural prosperity, as Ben said, the post-war period was defined by a melancholy mood of absence. What Ben left out in his complaint was, of course, the intervening years of Nazism terror. So, to get a fuller picture, it is helpful to consult another Berlin survivor. The empty center became an aesthetic issue only through Martin Kessel. In a few essays written after the war, he put a point on this issue. For him, Berlin had become a metaphorological problem. Kessel stated that the city had lost its iconic center that was able to represent the whole. Berlin is, he argued, no longer a structured space. It has no focus and subsequently no center. In this respect, Ben's metaphor proved its adequacy. Kessel edited the image of a Janus head, a Januskopf, in reference to the Roman god of thresholds. With this personification, he described a dialectical head that was turned inwards and outwards at the same time, but whose central point remained empty due to the divided state of Cold War Berlin. It was the head of a city, with each half pointing in a different direction towards New York and Moscow, and yet also directed towards each other, since they were connected by the common space of a no man's land. Kessel did not stop with this diagnosis of the head-to-head contest of two political orders within the city. He tried to capture a more characteristic trait of the spirit of the place. It led him to another figure which he called Berlin's demon of the idyll. In contrast to other big cities, Berlin's quietness seemed deceitful to him. Many things that were once familiar, places, squares, or infrastructures, had been wiped out, according to Kessel, by the intervention of world history. The concentration points are erased, displaced, or blocked. Some, such as Potsdamer Platz, were put into an artificial coma through political injections. Kessel concluded concerning the post-1945 scenario, in the center of Berlin, there is no real idyllic silence. It is rather one diabolical and paradoxical. With his expression, demon of the idyll, he pointed to the crucial sense of interregnum that Berliners experienced during these years. To quote his crucial phrase, "I see much here that is not there, not anymore, and not yet." The phrase summarizes the three temporal dimensions of the empty center: a not there of the present, a feeling of vacuum, and not anymore concerning the city's glorious past, and the phantoms that haunted flaneurs while walking through the city's vacant spaces. Turning now to the third section of my talk, I would like to briefly describe key venues of the empty center. This overview will spotlight three venues. First, the Tiergarten as a place of a particular temporal experience with the former district of the Old West nearby. Second, the Romanisches Café as a place of Weimar's unfulfilled promises, a place that is actually located outside what I call the inner delta. And finally, the double square of Anhalter and Potsdamer Platz, which will bring us back to the issue of the crypt. The Tiergarten at the heart of the city was once surrounded by the bourgeois area of the Alter Westen or Old West. It was the district of embassies and ministries, a concentration of political representation that culminated in the construction of Hitler's megalomaniacal Neue Reichskanzlei. Yet it was also, at least on the surface, a quiet part of town. For this reason, Benjamin in his Berliner Kindheit ironically ascribed to the Tiergarten the atmosphere of an eternal Sunday. A quarter of a century later, the Austrian author Franz Thumler, who was stranded in Berlin after the war, observed a dramatic change. The monuments of the imperial age that once embodied the aura of a peaceful post-histoire were now turned on the head. While historicism under Wilhelm II was already characterized by a doubtful idyll, after 1945, the flaneurs were confronted with different form of oppressive silence. These views intersect in the Tiergarten and generate a complex image that juxtaposes the archetypical Berlin image with its after-image. The idyllic grove of Imperial Berlin became, by the end of the war, a desolate land. In order to grasp the post-war atmosphere of Berlin, I would like to return to a term that Anders coined. I have in mind his Zeitgegend, which entertains a powerful affinity to what Benjamin called dialectics at a standstill. It describes a constellation leading to the confrontation of different times. Anders' time area caused something he wrote in his diary, Schrift an der Wand, like a vertigo historicus, an intense feeling of the dizzying changes in history. According to him, his stereoscopic images had their point of departure exactly in this area of Tiergarten and took on the form of a shock by making the past present. He observed, the Naumanns once lived here and the Bergers, somewhere they walked and slept. where the wind is now blowing and a new architecture is being built. He pointed to the air to indicate the homes of the former residents. The atmosphere became ghostly for him since he remembered the Jewish inhabitants of this former neighborhood of the Old West. The illusion of a post-war idyll of Berlin under reconstruction revealed its uncanny latent space. According to him, only the old street names and street signs of the former quarter were preserved. It reminds us of those cemeteries, Anders wrote in his diary, whose gravestones are left standing, even though the coffins and the dead have already been removed. It is precisely here, where his relatives and friends once lived, that he realizes his fundamental dilemma, his loneliness as survivor. The encounter in Berlin's no man's land made him into the witness of the vanished Jewish Berlin. Alfred Döblin, who came to Berlin on his journey through war-ravaged Germany, can be regarded as the exemplary witness to another lost place, the Romanisches Café. He felt the vacuum, describing himself in his Schicksalsreise as a Diogenes with a lantern as he walked through his ruined hometown. The former points of orientation seemed for Döblin, once an insider of the cultural life of the New West, almost impossible to find. It was an encounter of traumatic foreignness. Like the ancient philosopher who is said to have been out in daylight with a lantern to find a human being, Döblin wandered around Kurfürstendamm in search of his lost world. In front of the ruin of the Romanisches Café next to the destroyed memorial church, he identified his personal turning point. The old Romanisches Café is open. You can go in if you feel like. It is wide open. You can see into the back rooms right from the street, right up to the second floor. But nobody goes in. It was burned out. Next to the remnants of the coffee house, he remarked laconically, "Only I am still here and I stayed everything." The old Weimar meeting place resembled a nature morte. This building made the fate of their literature painfully legible to authors of the lost generation. The Romanisches Haus stood on damaged Kudamm, on the threshold between life and death, where people, as another Berlin flaneur, August Scholtis, sarcastically commented, did not want to refresh their memory. Looking at the building, he asked himself, who still thinks of days gone by? The age of dispersion finds its parallel in this embodiment of urban disappearance. Like Döblin before, Scholtis stood like a lost pedestrian before the now leveled square opposite the memorial church, on the spot where the Romanisches Café had once stood. No gravestone pointed the way to the Weimar author's forgotten promise of coffeehouse culture. I wandered around, Scholtis mourned, as he walked across the empty square, like a lost son in his home cemetery, looking for his parents' grave. But the principal witness of the vanished coffeehouse was Wolfgang Koeppen. In his eponymous text, A Romanisches Café, he describes it, a miniature about a single house, as Kaschnitz summarized it, in which a piece of history comes alive. The text depicts the transformation of the Romanisches house from its construction in the age of Wilhelm II to its end in the firestorm of 1943. In this piece, from his Berlin fragments, a world is depicted at the moment of its collapse. For Koeppen, the Romanisches Café resembled a ghost ship suddenly disappeared with its unique intellectual freight. It housed, according to him, a pandemonium of the metropolitan way of life, representing the hustle and bustle of Berlin. According to the author, it was not only the poets and philosophers who met to discuss here, but also the clever gentlemen of the newspapers, the confident members of parliament of all political directions, and even the anarchists expressed their views. This diverse group was united in the fact that they were destined for the same downfall. Everything, as Koeppen wrote, was to dissolve into nothing. The end of the coffee house began in 1933 with the presence of a Gestapo table. Those who remained, Koeppen confessed, were ashamed of the press tolerated by the regime and the great betrayal. Koeppen's text ends with a firestorm with the smashed memorial church and the Romanisches Café, which glowed as if a golden flame of a secret fatherland became visible at the moment of its collapse. Koeppen, however, never forgot the promise of the Romanisches Café. He rediscovered it on his excursions to other cities, which he documented in his travel books. In Paris, for example, at the corner of Boulevard Raspail, his ghost ship had dropped anchor, or in London, where he found a similar coffee house culture in the immigrants' quarter of like Hampstead. Koeppen was someone who had the ability to draw on his personal memories when confronted with post-war Berlin. This made him a key figure for the empty center. On the occasion of a visit to Berlin, he described the city's ruinous state as the surrealism of a former power center that now had weeds in its middle. Especially Potsdamer Platz, once the busiest square in Central Europe, had fallen into a godforsaken silence. For some people, he wrote in his first travel book, Nach Russland und anderswohin, the world ends here. On his return, stumbling across the squares of Anhalt and Potsdamer Platz, a dead end near the wall, he asked himself whether this was a piece of truth or just a chimera. It was a piece of the most real ground that German literature could find on its own soil in those years, but at the same time a surreal one, a wasteland with ruins into which, to employ a phrase from Benjamin's book on the German Trauerspiel, the tragedy of recent history had wandered. But Koeppen was not the only one of his generation who regarded the area of devastated Potsdamer Platz as iconic. For instance, the Polish emigre Witold Gombrowicz, invited to post-war Berlin by the Ford Foundation to be part of the cultural-political project and to fill the vacuum in the city's literary life, made similar observations. He conducted, as the old European flaneur, his own phenomenology of Berlin's voids, since he lived as temporary resident near in the new Hansaviertel. His Berliner Notizen depict an emptiness made visible through a silent loneliness of winterly fields in the area around Potsdamer Platz. Others, such as the pastor and flaneur Kurt Ihlenfeld, called this partly closed-off area of the most extraordinary corner, where the hidden heartbeat of the city could still be heard. Here, a contact zone where the eastern side was most visible, but equally a feeling of stagnation. Other crucial observations were made by Celan in the expression of a Turm for the rest of the Anhalter portal, and by Kessel regarding the fractal-like shape of Potsdamer Platz. What was specific to each of them? In the case of Anhalter fragment, it was an iconic piece of rubble. Potsdamer Platz, meanwhile, was a former focal point of the city that had been decimated like hardly any other square. While the ruin of the Anhalter represented for the exiles a site of memory, notably regarding the expulsion after Nazi takeover, the Potsdamer Platz figured as a more ambiguous place. The old S-Bahn, the railway station from the Wilhelminian era, was cut at various points after the war. This resulted in abundant stations only used for transit, so-called Geisterbahnhöfe, or ghost stations, and Potsdamer Platz was one of them. These areas of intersecting spheres formed subsequently points of, as Uwe Jonsson formulated it, forced contact between the two opposing ideological systems. But precisely this paradoxical situation produced crypt-like spaces in the underground below old Potsdamer Platz. These were subterranean catacombs, which, as hidden spaces, preserved something of the previous era of the interwar years and also of the war and its ruins. One might call them time capsules. It was thus Gombrowicz who recommended potential Berlin poets they should visit these underworlds in order to understand the post-war genius loci. But you, poet, he advised in his Berliner Notizen, if you want to reach the source, you will have to go underground. Only then, he argued, can one break through the surface and explore the hidden experiences of violence and pain and grief. Let me break off my description of the three venues at this point. My remarks have sought to show how these sites represent different features of the broader phenomenon of Berlin's empty center. Anders' Zeitgegend of Tiergarten represents an entanglement of time and space with the neighboring Old West as an extreme example of a vanished place. And as center becomes periphery, Zeitgegend also becomes a place of contemplation and learning. Secondly, I try to describe the Romanisches Café as Weimar's former house of literature, an unusual anarchic one, intellectually destroyed by the Nazi regime and physically by Allied bombing. But it remained for some, like Koeppen, a promise, a concrete utopia that had survived its demise. And finally, we had a brief look at the two squares of Anhalter and Potsdamer Platz. The one, as Celan showed, a demonic remnant that evoked memories of displacement and deportation. The other, as Gombrowicz pointed out, a frozen field of historical reflections with well-preserved catacombs below, waiting for future. Coming to the end of my talk, I would like to take the opportunity to highlight three systematic arguments that animate my work. The first point concerns a different concept of the topos, understood as a place of aesthetic production. This approach is distinct from the philological branch of topos research. Thus, I take up Celan's polemic in his Büchnerpreis speech, in which he called for a more inventive approach. In contrast to Motivforschung or aesthetics of reception, my aim is to demonstrate the productive forces of the place. Even though there are recognizable affinities with classical topoi, the empty center remains a category of its own. A kindred idea is captured in the aesthetic formula inspired by the philosopher Joachim Ritter of a secret affiliation of the terrible and the idyllic, which was omnipresent in post-war Berlin and made it a crossing point of demonic visions of all kinds. The empty center became an unofficial locus communis of a lost generation, which approached the encapsulated space from the West and the East as well as from exile. In Berlin, members of this generation discovered an entanglement of centrality, emptiness, and dispersion. Far from Paris, these flaneurs in rubble inhabited the Trauerspiel. The second argument pertains to the empty center as a historical problem bearing on the concept of the epoch and its notion of rupture. Post-war Berlin suffered, in the words of the historian Lucian Hölscher, from an epochal haunting caused by a number of unresolved problems. With the image of the empty center, a different model of an intermittent but also ongoing process emerged, making the cryptic space of the city into a transit zone of history. This inner zone presented itself as a hinge in an era that was dominated by a phenomenon that Hamburger called the foreshortening of history. In doing so, both Hölscher and Hamburger echoed a thought of the historian Reinhard Koselleck, who regarded the post-war period as a time of stasis of blocked experiences that remained unarticulated. In order to find an image for this resistance to language, I made reference to the psychoanalytical concept of the crypt. The crypt of Berlin had three dimensions. On the surface, the site of deprivation in black, and underneath, a tomb of unspoken events. Secondly, a place of preservation of something painfully and stubbornly latent. And finally, a capsule of unrealized horror that has not been internalized, but swallowed or incorporated, as Abraham Montoro put it. These two main threads culminated in a reflection on aesthetic form. I explore the ways that the empty center shaped, if not its own genre, a rich abundance of small forms. I refer in particular to an aesthetics of the fragmentary, a style of compression that Koeppen termed literary leftovers. Johannes Bobrowski addressed the status of the aesthetic miniature once by highlighting the poetic mosaic as the smallest element of a wider, albeit fragile work of remembrance. Occasional forms, from the aphorism to diary entries, in addition to the letter and the poem, provided dominant modes of expression. In this context, it was once again Kessel who emphasized these small forms and pointed out to the relation between poetic fragments and the ruined city. He outlined this aesthetic tendency when he remarked that in destructive times, the large forms are sometimes exhausted, but small ruderals, like flowers on the rubble, may flourish unexpectedly. He drew this conclusion in light of the fundamentally changed situation of the post-war years. The shift towards small forms amounted to a literal response to catastrophe. It is perhaps not surprising that my own attempt to write a literary history of Berlin's post-war topos itself demanded a kind of mosaic work. Ultimately, the process of writing this book entailed bringing together the dispersed fragments of a largely forgotten literary legacy to produce a new image of this era, the empty center. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Till, for this very rich talk about your really important book. It is so important to bring together in this mosaic voices, both of exiles and people returning permanently or briefly, and those that have stayed, whereby obviously the term inner emigration is problematic.
Yeah.
And interesting that you employ it for both the GDR then as well, I'll just start off with one very short question, and then look at the chat and invite other people to formulate their questions. And that is about methodology. I was very interested in what you said about hermeneutics, dealing with the unsaid of a text, and then saying similar things about trauma theory, that you circle around and cannot mean the unspeakable, and then you use psychoanalysis. So I was wondering how you find it to fruitfully combine hermeneutics, psychoanalysis, and trauma theory. How does that work for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Was it kind of just to say it French, bric-a-brac, to put different pieces of theory together? But the basic idea was, first of all, as you mentioned before, this is a hermeneutic approach. The work has an hermeneutic approach. That is true, and it is meant to be one. But I had the impression that I have to radicalize the established hermeneutics by referring to these theories of trauma. And when I worked on the book, I stumbled across the theory by Abraham and Torok, both exiled and both people that survived from that have been persecuted by the Nazis, actually. And they invented this trauma theory of the crypt. So I basically tried to put these two elements together. And on the other hand, going back to hermeneutics in order to enrich a bit the theory of trauma and put it in into a broader horizon, broader perspective. But it was a kind of as I said, a bit bric-a-brac.
It's a very striking combination. There are compliments in the chat, but no questions. Would anybody like to ask a question? You can raise your hands or just no.
I would like to ask a question. I can't find my hand, but
we can hear you.
Sorry about that. I can equally not find my image, but Gabriele Weiss Sussex here, just asking. So what you describe about as the small forms, the fragmentary, makes immediate sense. Of course, it's absolutely absolutely easy to understand, and yeah. I can follow that, but doesn't it also, I think that's not unique, is it, to the description of cityscapes, or in particular to the description of the destroyed center of Berlin? Isn't it a real sort of turnaround moment for Nachkriegsliteratur much more generally, this idea that we don't trust rhetoric anymore, we don't trust the big forms, all we can do after this disaster is to use the small forms, the pithy, I'm thinking of the texts of Borchert, the short stories of Borchert. Then do you think that's right?
Yeah, that sounds quite right, actually. What you mentioned with the mistrust of rhetoric, I think this is really the crucial point that Koeppen, that Kessel had in mind when he said that the large forms are exhausted, exactly for that reason. When you look back at these kind of monumental forms of representation, for instance, that the Nazi propaganda used. And he said, no, we have to get rid of these large monumental forms and go to the small and dense one back again. So that sounds totally convincing.
If I'm allowed another question on the
Please.
back of that. So by negation, then, that is a reference to the Nazi period.
Yeah,
and
it is.
I was exactly. So I was missing that in your talk, that, this kind of, I was very struck by the Kessel way of wording things, the intervention of world history. That's all that's said about the Nazi period. Memories are to memories of the city, how it was before the Nazis came. So there's this complete gap. And this gap, I wonder, that seems to me, listening to you, not just by the exiles who left and therefore only remember, the memories before, but also it seems to be across the board, this complete...
Totally. This is, for instance, why Koeppen could never finish his project on the Berlin from the 1930s till the post-war era. And so for him, he was, for me, the person who symbolizes actually this kind of massive gap. And I think you're right, of course. And this was a bit the idea, to say, they weren't able to bring these pieces together. But for instance, you can find fragmentary forms, unpublished ones, as for instance in Koeppen's archive, and you can see when you look at his way of production, he tried. But apparently he never accomplished. And I think Kessel is a similar figure. He was not able to bring these pieces together. There's always this remaining gap.
But the point is that they speak about the gap, isn't it? Without naming it. But it actually, the whole book centers around this gap.
Yeah, this is true. This is true. But the idea is that to find an image also for these kind of this suppressed kind of things. They're not mentioning, of course.
Could you say a bit more about whether there are differences between the so-called inner emigrants and the ones who have been hounded out? I mean, even on a I don't know, a stylistic level or anything that betrays some kind of.
I mean, for the one thing that I briefly mentioned was this method of writing between the lines.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, when you look at the lyrical forms of Oskar Loerke, he used exactly this kind of poetics in the things he published or the things that he wrote, as we call it, for the Schublade. So they are unpublished, lots of unpublished works still in Marbach in the archive. So, and he used this mode of writing between the lines. And when you look later on what Huchel did in his what he himself called, also Hamburger called, his inner exile in the GDR, he used exactly the same kind of techniques to evade and get around the censorship in the eastern city. And another possibility was always to publish on the other side. Huh? That's what Huchel did. And also Bobrovsky, who published at the DVR at first. Yeah. So of course there were different modes of dealing with this problem. Of course, when you're writing, when you have to face censorship, it's a totally different kind of writing. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Not that I can see.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I wish I'd heard this before I visited Berlin about 5 years ago, because I had no idea. And I was the guest of some German lawyers, and either they didn't want to, I mean, they didn't take us to the Holocaust Memorial. They took us out of town to the palace, you know, that we were treated like tourists rather than intellectual visitors who, anyway, it's just a comment. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed your talk. I found it very illuminating.
Yeah. Katja.
Another thing that I would like to say or to ask is how struck I am that really that area, especially of the Potsdamer Platz, has for a long period afterwards remained this area of inquiry, this area of testing of what literature can do. And not just literature, film. I'm thinking
film
of
also Wenders, of course.
Wim Wenders, exactly. But I'm also thinking of texts like Annette Groschner's exploration of she sends a photographer and a writer into Potsdamer Platz and then looks at what they come back with and, you know, concludes literature can dig so much deeper. So, but, you know, it's always this returning. That's in the 1980s, both of them. So it's always this returning to that. It's still fruitful then.
Yeah. Or for instance, this couple of photographers, the Eikemeyers, they made a kind of it's almost a documentary of the Potsdamer Platz from the 60s to the 90s. So there are lots of artists that still constantly circling around this Potsdamer Platz.
I saw that Katja Krylova raised her hands. Are you still there, Katja?
Thank you very much, Andrea. I can't switch my video on.
We can hear you
because it was disabled before, but that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I was wondering, because the title of your book is Die Leere Zentrale, and we were speaking ahead of the talk about Berlin now. And, you know, would you say that there is still, would you say there is still a Leere Zentrale in Berlin nowadays? I mean, how do you see that? Or has that completely been overcome by unification in the past 35 years and so on? Do we still have a wound in the city?
I would argue that there are still remnants of the Leere Zentrale, especially when you just walk around a bit around the Philharmonie and the Staatsbibliothek. This was actually, this is a bit this what I call, what they call the Alter Westen, and you can still feel it has a strange atmosphere. No, there's lots of space still. That's the reason why they are now building this new museum of the 20th century exactly in this area. It's quite telling, actually. It's the museum of the 20th century that they're building in the middle of the old West. So I think they still have a problem to fill this gap, isn't it? For instance, there.
Interesting. Thank you.
We have gone over time a little. If there are no more questions, I will just thank you again for this very, very interesting talk. And
thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening and for asking questions. And thank you very much. Thank you, Till.
Yeah, and thank you for the questions and the discussion.